Carl, we had an attack on Ukraine, a drone attack, and Keith Kellogg came out and said this is one of the largest attack on Ukraine. What is going on with the case of Ukraine? Why it's so difficult for the West to do something about it? Because after all, you look at the Trump administration together with Europeans, it's all about putting more pressure on Russia in terms of the oil, in terms of the way that they're exporting their oil to India. We know that here is what they reported on Fox News: five important importers of Russian oils.
See it. China spends 229 million on Russian oil, discount for them. India 140 million. Now they're getting a 50% tariff for that. Hit Turkey, a NATO ally, 95 million. The European Union 74, and Brazil.
You see, look at the list. You see China, India, Turkey, European Union, and Brazil. I don't see the United States going against China because they said that China is too big for us to go against them. India is somehow, they're so comfortable to go against India, which led to what's going on between Iran and India. I don't know, a diplomatic team is going to Iran. They're going to somehow expand the relationship, and because they want to send their products to the Central Asia through Iran, because India is finding some sort of alternative for what's going on with the case of Ukraine and the pressure they're receiving from the United States. You see Turkey, European Union, and Brazil. I don't see Brazil backing down. It comes to Turkey and European Union. It seems that the final solution in the mind of the Trump administration would be India, pressure on India, and European Union. Even Turkey is not the case, it seems. Your take on that?
Well, this is a very peculiar situation because, first of all, the figures you have shown show just the direct import from Russia. But as to India, as an example, they buy essentially crude oil from from Russia, and then they refine this crude oil to sell it to Europe. Meaning that what the European buy and what the figure that was on the table you showed, the figure that you have is a direct import from Russia by Europe. But there's an indirect way to receive. Most of the oil used in Europe comes from Russia, directly or indirectly. Indirectly, it comes from Turkey and from India, after being refined in those countries. I mean, if you look at the, I have probably here a diagram that shows how India has expanded its imports from Russia, because it started to deal with the refined oil. I am not sure I have it here. Probably not, unfortunately. Anyway, so meaning that there is a lot of hypocrisy here, because Europe still buys Russian oil, but indirectly, as we said. And the idea was to keep India buying this oil, because the problem is that oil, you have a given quantity of oil on the market if you want. If you remove completely an actor such as Russia, if you would isolate completely Russia, if Russia wouldn't be able to sell any drop of oil, that would be a massive oil shortage in the market, and oil price would skyrocket. And for that reason, in fact, that was, and I can remind you, probably just to show that, sorry, the date is in French, but in November 2022, the Americans prompted India to continue buying oil, because they didn't want to have the oil market being completely destabilized. And in fact, we have also earlier in 2022, the the Americans warned the Europeans against extensive sanction in the energy area, because that was in create an inflation on the oil, I mean, energy market at large, because it's not just oil, it's also gas and things like this. And in fact, the Europeans didn't want to listen to that. As a result, they continue what they wanted, but they used also, and that's something they are not very proud of saying, because they use those indirect ways through India, and they say, well, it's not Russian oil. And the same applies to this oil that has been, for instance, those direct imports. I mean, sometimes you have, even at sea, tankers exchanging oil and mixing oil, Russian oil with other oil, and therefore you can say, well, it's not Russian, it's oil from UAE or wherever, you see. So they tend to play with words in order to show a different picture. So the table you showed is very nominal, but it doesn't reflect the reality. That's the first thing. Second thing is that India, and as that was explained, by the way, by Foreign Minister Jaishankar recently in an interview. He said, well, we have the GDP per head in India is around $2,000, while it is something like 20,000 plus in Europe and so on. So we cannot afford to pay our oil more, because this would have a very strong destabilizing effect on the economy. The lower your revenue, you don't have a margin of error or margin of maneuver, and therefore it's the cheapest your oil and your energy is, the better it is for this. India has a big economy, but it's still a very fragile one. It's expanding, it's improving, but it's very much fragile. You have a lot of agricultural activities that are, by nature, the nature of this activity, extremely fragile, and therefore also sensitive to the changes on the market, especially when you have, for instance, the US, because the US was complaining that India sells more agriculture farming and agriculture product to US, as vice versa. The problem is that the US products are too expensive for India. Therefore, you have here and therefore you also have protectionist measure by India in order to prevent the destabilization of the market. And that's why India is somehow in a corner of the room, because it has no freedom of movement to accept or deny tariffs and things like that on energy product. And for that reason, since India now can afford to be closer to the BRICS, can afford, because it has better relations with China and others, it can count on the BRICS market, if I can put it extremely simply. And therefore, India today can afford to say to the US, sorry guys, but we are not going to comply. I mean, if you impose tariffs on us, well, so be it. Then we will not sell to the US, we sell to other countries, period. We just forget the US market. And that's also the position of China. Of course, China, because it exports much more to the US and has it exports also much more sensitive materials such as rare earth and also very sensitive products such as semiconductors or elements for semiconductors and other high-tech system. Therefore, China has a huge leverage on the US and say, well, if you put tariffs on us, then we'll just stop selling you items. That's what they have started to do with the rare earths and things like this. So China is protected, not because it's a big country, but because it has strategic products that are not just useful, but are necessary for the US, not just economy, but also US defense and things like this. I think we have mentioned in your show a few months ago that a lot of components of missiles and aircraft and Navy ships and things like this, they have a lot of components come directly from China. If China would not be able to provide this, then the whole thing would collapse. So China has a lot of leverage over the US. But in turn, India can rely on China for economic support, especially today. Therefore, we have, and that's the result of this change we have seen in the world, that because the so-called rest of the world has the ability to exist economically, politically, strategically, it can exist without the West. And in fact, we have, if I can say, I use always this picture because just after World War II, the US were the engine of the West, the locomotive, if you take a train, the locomotive. And the US used to pull all the West economically, industrially, and all that. But now this ability of the US has faded. It doesn't it produces still, but much less than it used to. Now the Europeans are more independent from the US than they used to be 40, but probably 60 or 70 years ago. And today, the rest of the world is the same situation. They are not depending on the West. They have developed their own capacities. And that's very true with China. China has become today the engine of the rest of the world. It has the same position as the US had after World War II, but for the rest of the world. And that's exactly what the West tends to forget. As a result, when we cut ties, or when we threaten countries to cut ties with them economically, well, they can say, well, no problem, we just go to China. You see, and vice versa. When the Americans started to impose tariffs, that was early this year, when they started to impose tariffs on China, China said, okay, you want to impose tariffs? Fine, then we don't buy our soybeans to the US. We changed the provider, and they went to Brazil. Now Brazil is supplying China in soybeans, and all the contracts with soybeans with the US have been canceled. As a result, you have millions of dollars that have been lost by US farmers, because for the Chinese, there was a possible substitute for the US on the market. And now that's the reason why the BRICS today are so complementary with each other, that in fact they can almost, probably not completely yet, but they can almost live as a parallel market, from separated from the Western market. And this is this change of the strategic situation, and that's what Trump has not understood. He still applies the old gunboat diplomacy that was applied since the late 19th century, and he's still applying that. Of course, it's not exactly, with the exception of Venezuela, where they still send the gunboats. But when it comes to other countries, it's not the gunboat as such. I mean, the means have changed, is the tariffs and sanctions. You see, but it's exactly the same idea. I want that from you. If you don't want to give it voluntarily, I will force you to give me what I want. And that's exactly what Trump is doing. This is exactly what has done with Europe. This is exactly what he's trying to do with in the Middle East, uh, and that's exactly what he tried to do with Iran. That's exactly what he has done with Europe recently with this extraordinary agreement he had with Ursula von der Leyen. He just raised the tariffs, and then the debate is not about whether there should be tariffs or not. It's, I raise the tariff. No, if you want, I can just go a little bit. I can go down a little bit with the tariffs. So it's definitely a policy of pressure. And that's exactly what Trump has said, by the way, also for other issues like peace under pressure. I mean, he wants to have agreements under force. And that's, I have compared this with the mafia type of a deal. If you don't do that, I will destroy your shop. It's exactly what he's doing. The problem is that now you have alternatives. And since the dollar remains one of the main tools of the US, let's say, it's not policy, but the US leverage, the dollar is the main tool for that, then the best way to escape US pressure, I mean, one of them is to be independent from the dollar, therefore to de-dollarize. And the whole movement of the BRICS and what we have seen recently in Tianjin in China is about this, is how can we have a market that doesn't use the dollar in order to reduce that vulnerability. And it's very important to understand what Trump hasn't, is that the dollar was a strength 50 years ago, because obviously everything was okay. The US were not weaponizing the dollar. But today, the dollar has become a vulnerability for all these countries. So they don't want to stop trade with the West or things like that, but they just want to stop to be vulnerable to the dollar. Therefore, they will continue to trade as much as they can, but they will de-dollarize. And if we don't accept this, then they will trade between themselves, because now you have, we mentioned India. It's a fragile economy, but it's a developing economy. It developed very fast, and it develops in multiple ways, not just in agriculture, but also in high-tech area and things like this. So meaning that it will be very easy for BRICS countries or non-Western countries to find alternative to the Western market, both to sell product and to buy product. You see? And therefore, India has been caught in that. It is still in the triad, if we can say, this triad of Russia, China, and India in the within the BRICS. India remains more or less the weak link, because not just structurally, but also politically, because India has always tried to keep a very balanced relationship between East and West. Even during the Cold War, it's a non-aligned country. Even if most of its military equipment came from Soviet Union, it managed to keep good relations with the West. And after the Cold War, India maintained this non-alignment policy, trying to have good relationship with all the main actors, with Russia, obviously, but also with the West and the United States and the European Union.